I wanted to emphasize women's communities,
Mhm.
especially women's communities in a wartime setting. And part of what I wanted to do with this book is show some of the various ways that women contribute and are active participants in these processes because I think those stories get lost in history. I think in a lot of historical settings, women are shown as just victims of the brutality of war. And yes, that is true. And I did also want to show that in my book, but I also wanted to show them as people who are influencing their community. And often that influence affects the entire trajectory of a conflict. So I tell people that every woman in this book is in some way an activist or a human rights defender, whether it's, Granny Cho, who's in that compound, or the doctor that they meet. They're all trying to make a difference in some way.
This is Story to Count with Jen Jumba. In conversations with writers, something magical happens, and as readers, we begin to see them as human beings and not just the name on the spine of a book. My hope is through these conversations, you learn about their craft and them as a person, you'll become like me. Fiercely loyal, want to read their current book, entire backlist, any future book, or any book they blurb. And when you see their name, you'll want to support them, not only as incredible storytellers, but also the thoughtful individuals you have come to know. I'm super excited because my guest today is E.J. Chung. She is a Taiwanese American lawyer and women's human rights specialist. She's worked on a range of issues, including torture, sexual violence, contemporary forms of slavery, and discriminatory legislation. Her writing is inspired by social justice movements and the continued struggle for equality and fundamental freedoms worldwide. I was lucky enough to moderate a panel with Eve when her debut novel, The Daughters of Shandong, came out. Found it to be one of the most beautiful stories I have ever read. Her new book, The Young Will Remember, is just as stunning in capturing a moment in history through firsthand experience with a war correspondent named Ellie Chang. E.J. Chung lives in New York with her husband, 2 children, and 2 dogs. So I'm so excited that you're here to talk about your brand new book that publishes this week, The Young Will Remember. So can you give us a little introduction to this book?
Yes, thank you so much for having me. And also, thank you so much for your early support. I remember you as one of the first people who was so enthusiastic about Daughters of Sandong, and I really appreciate that, especially as a new author. So, The Young Will Remember is my second book, and it is about a Chinese/Taiwanese American correspondent who goes to cover a pivotal battle. Her plane gets shot down over North Korea and she gets stranded there. And she relies on help from 2 North Korean women to find her way back to essentially American territory during that war when the battle lines are moving very quickly and there are a lot of life-threatening situations all around her. So, yeah, I mean, it was an intense project.
I can imagine because it was intense reading it. And you
Mm.
did a wonderful job of making me feel as the reader that I was right alongside with Ellie as she's navigating all of these things. And first of all, you're capturing this moment in history, 1950. So where did you get the idea to want to tell this story? I mean, there's so many things happening in the world and so many pieces of history. What made you choose this in particular?
So I picked the North Korean setting because my husband is half Korean and his grandfather was from Pyongyang and he was a pastor and he actually fled Pyongyang shortly after World War II. So I picked this time because it was such an important moment in Chinese, Korean, and American history. And the aftermath of this particular war still influences our geopolitics today.
Yeah, it is so well done. Think it's Brene Brown says that it's hard to hate people up close. And so what you've really
Yeah.
done with this book is you've taken and given a human name and a face to the situation she finds herself in. She's relying on the support of 2 North Korean women. Can you introduce us to Imo and what is referred to as Emma?
Yes. So when I first started thinking about this story, I imagine it only between Ellie and Emma. So I think a lot about mothers in war. So I wanted this to focus on motherhood. And I often tell people the initial title, which is not a good title, but in my head when I was thinking it, I thought of the changeling in part because Ellie sort of takes the place of another woman's daughter.
Yes.
So it focused so much on them, but when I was writing it, the character who Ellie calls Emo just kind of inserted herself. And that was really interesting because I didn't really envision a big role for her. And for my writing process, I never outline. So I have a vague idea, and usually I know like the place, I know where I want the story to end, but I don't really know anything in between. So as I was writing, Emo just became a bigger and bigger person, and I feel like that's true to her personality too. She kind of just inserts herself in
Yes.
places and demands attention. So she added a complexity to the story that I really loved and I didn't anticipate. So Emo, for background, when we meet her, she is Pastor Pig's wife. So when Ellie crash lands into this town called Kanye, which is very close to the Chinese border, it's Emma who mistakes her for her daughter, essentially, at first, and takes her to the home that she's staying in, which is Pastor Pake's house. And Pastor Pake, I developed a lot with the idea of my husband's grandfather in mind. So I interviewed my mother in law. I also interviewed my husband, who did know his grandfather. His grandfather already passed away, but Emo is Pastor Pake's wife, who initially is very hostile to Ellie. And we kind of find out why as the story progresses, but she's in contrast to Pastor Pig, who's just this incredibly friendly, curious man who's actually excited that there is an English speaker in his house. Prior to researching this book, I didn't know anything about the Christian presence in North Korea. So that really surprised me as I did my research.
It surprised me too, and I think it's a wonderful way to introduce us to parts of history that we often don't learn about. And I think what ends up happening, and I hope for other people who are reading this too, that this kind of inspires them to learn even more about that particular time period in history, because
Mhm.
I did not realize Christianity was such a big deal in that part of the world. And to your point, when you think about a pastor's wife, certainly emo is not who comes to mind, right? You normally would think of somebody who's a little bit kinder and a little bit more benevolent, but she certainly has um, a determination about her and a spirit about her. And at the same time, you think about Emma mistakes her Ellie, mistakes Ellie for her being her daughter, and actually ends up in part saving her life because after the plane gets shot down, soldiers are coming and approaching. And
Mhm.
Emma makes this big deal like, oh, this is my, daughter who, I haven't seen in years. She was taken away. So saves her life. And then Ellie finds herself in a completely different house than which she grew up in, different culture and different traditions, and trying to figure out how she's going to get back so that she can get back home.
Mhm. Yes. It was kind of so the two-woman contrast, and if you read I mean, I know you read my first book, but if readers have read my first book, I see parts of Emo kind of like Dee, the sister in my first book, where, you know, she's a survivor, and she is a very strong person, and I think she can be very rough, but she also cares a lot. Like, she has a very strong sense of justice and fairness, which I think initially gets lost when you just meet her very, very abrasive personality.
Right. Yeah. First impressions would not lend themselves to thinking that she was incredibly kind. But I think the great thing about storytelling is that you give us the ability as readers to kind of see inside their
Mhm,
brain, their heart, their soul in terms of why they're choosing to say what they're saying or do what they're doing, which I think
mhm,
is a wonderful thing. And it brings about complicated feelings for Ellie because technically she's now behind enemy lines in this part of the world, and at the same time, they're extending her the warmth of their house and their hospitality and their food and shelter, basic Maslow's, hierarchy of needs.
mhm. Yeah, and I think Ellie, at least has so I call her a woman between worlds.
Yes.
So I think Ellie goes into it at least, when she first meets Emma, she makes a remark that she looks like someone who could be my mom.
Mhm.
And so I do think that matters to her when she sees or she thinks that death is approaching. And I did want to highlight that relationship of these two people who are on the opposite side of a war, but can nevertheless develop not just a friendship, but almost a familial relationship just based on, we're together. And I think a lot of times people don't talk enough face to face. I think things are very different when you meet someone in the flesh, what you might, um, I guess I don't know. I just think right now, especially in this age, there's a lot of tendency to be very cruel in like an online space and say things that you would never say to a person,
Face to
if you
face
meet them face to
for fear
face.
getting punched, right?
That, and I also think there's just something that's different when you're meeting someone, and I think we need more of that in so many parts of our world.
Absolutely agreed. And I also was struck by the sense of community that's
Mhm,
developed. And we see this, throughout history. When times are tough, you see characters essentially revealed and you see who people really come together and you truly see the very worst, the very best of people.
mhm,
And so navigating that community that they find themselves in as to whether or not they should stay in that town because who's approaching and when are they approaching creates an enormous amount of tension. Even though I know how the situation ends,
mhm.
I'm on the edge of my seat in this book.
Okay, thank you, thank you. Um, yeah, so I wanted to emphasize women's communities,
Mhm.
especially women's communities in a wartime setting. And part of what I wanted to do with this book is show some of the various ways that women contribute and are active participants in these processes because I think those stories get lost in history. I think in a lot of historical settings, women are shown as just victims of the brutality of war. And yes, that is true. And I did also want to show that in my book, but I also wanted to show them as people who are influencing their community. And often that influence affects the entire trajectory of a conflict. So I tell people that every woman in this book is in some way an activist or a human rights defender, whether it's, Granny Cho, who's in
Yes.
that compound, or the doctor that they meet. They're all trying to make a difference in some way.
Yeah, and I think it's an important lesson for all of us. You with your work being, somebody who is, championing and an advocate working as an attorney, for women's rights. There are things that we can do just as human beings on a smaller scale that makes a difference. That yes, it
Mhm.
would be lovely to have this big epic impact, but the small impact still makes a difference in somebody's life and ultimately the trajectory of their life.
Yes, and I think a lot of times it's those small impacts that are longer lasting. The collective action of a lot of people tends to, I think, endure for longer just because of the sheer volume of voices behind it.
I think about Ellie and I think about the fact that she's not just there were a lot of nurses that worked during this time period and would hop on the military planes to help the soldiers who had been wounded. And at the same time you have Ellie, but she's seeing through the lens of being a correspondent of war. So she's
Mhm,
seeing things a little bit differently. And at one point she is kind of questioned about why she is choosing to work as a journalist about this
mhm.
conflict. And she says, I believe in telling the truth and I care about democracy. In order to make the right decisions and to vote for the right representatives, people have to know what's happening. They deserve to have real information. So it goes to
Yes.
your point about things being lost because it depends on who's reporting it, who's
Mhm,
capturing that, who's quote unquote winning in terms
mhm.
of that narrative. So I think it's so important that you choose Ellie's profession to be that of a war correspondent, which shapes how she's seeing things.
Yeah, so that was um there was a process to get to her profession because I originally wanted Ellie to be a pilot. And when I first imagined it, and I tell people that this was sort of and I should know that progress is never linear or it's
Yes.
rarely linear. But somehow in my mind, I thought, oh, well, there were women flying as, for the WASPs in World War II. So, of course, there will also be women flying planes in the Korean War. But to find that they actually took a step back. And so no women were allowed to fly into the Korean peninsula. So then I shifted to trying to have Ellie be a flight nurse. But then that was hard because at least, and I say like, again, everyone's different, but at least when I imagine a nurse, I imagine someone who will stop and help wounded people. So I was thinking, well, Ellie's never gonna, her entire journey will probably be
Be
because there were
100
so many
yards.
wounded civilians. I mean, that could be a very interesting story. I think it just isn't quite what I wanted to tell here. So that was when I came across Maggie Higgins, who was a female war correspondent. And I came across her after several different sources indicating there are no women on the front lines except for nurses, or like no women in combat. But again, that shows, I think, women's input often sort of fall to the sidelines when you have Maggie Higgins, who was actually at the Battle of Chosin, and she was there just, that scene that Ellie arrives there.
Yes.
Maggie Higgins was there when the Marines, actually, she arrived before Ellie did. She was there as the Marines walked back. So I read her memoir, and then so Ellie's role as a correspondent, I think, was easier for me to write because I think a lot of that overlaps with my feelings about news and the importance of amplifying people's stories so we know what's happening. And there was one part, just to add here, because there was a lot of pressure on correspondents like Ellie. So I only put like a few sentences on, but they were pressured not to make the casualties look too bad. And that was something that was a fight between them and MacArthur's office at the time. And I wanted to say a lot more about it, but I didn't want to go on. It was World War II. Apparently, all of the news releases had to go through the military, and the military had to clear them before they could be published. And so the Korean War, they didn't do that. But there was this idea of voluntary censorship, which a lot of journalists did not do, which was a constant source of tension between them and MacArthur's office.
Yeah, there's a scene opening in the book where she's squatting in the hangar. She
Yeah.
has her typewriter. I mean, times have changed. I mean, now we can do things
Mhm.
from the palm of our hand, but she's got her typewriter kind of, she's
Mhm.
squatted down and she's trying to type. And Barbara, her friend who's a flight nurse, I mean, she's savvy. Ellie is savvy enough to realize if I want to get a different perspective instead of going to these quote unquote press conferences, I'll just ride with the flight nurses and befriend them and develop a
Mhm.
good rapport. And the flight nurse takes and rips it out of her hand and is like, no, no, you have to tell this. You can't
Mhm.
self or voluntarily censor what you're going to
Mhm.
send. And you do a wonderful job in the story of infusing with news stories and letters. It's just such a beautifully woven tapestry of a story to showcase what's happening.
Thank you. So I need to give a shout out to my editor because my original draft, I had the letters that Emma wrote to her daughter. And
Yes.
I had a lot of history. And it was my editor who was saying the history within the text was starting to weigh it down a little too much.
Okay.
So she suggested using interstitial materials to fill in those gaps so I could cut it out of the narrative, which ended initially I was skeptical because I was telling my editor I actually tend to skip over interstitial material, but apparently most people don't. So it's been
No,
great that
you
people
don't.
are so I put them in, and that was actually really fun in the sense that I got to sort of pick out the pieces that I wanted to include. And it added, I think, another dimension to the story with the foreign correspondence records and the diaries and the real nonfiction sources. The quotes, too. I don't think I had the quotes in the first draft either, but once I started using the snippets of the foreign correspondence record, I thought, oh, I should put this quote at the beginning because that also gives a context.
It does a really good thing. I mean, from my perspective as a reader, because I am not trained as a writer, everything for me is strictly visceral. But
Hmm.
having that material there kind of grounded me
Mm.
in a way to then allow the story to continue to evolve, almost like I could pause, take a breath, and then know I would see that next part of the story, through Ellie and Emma and Emo, but
Hmm.
also having being grounded in the history and the news that were, the facts and just the facts type of approach.
Yeah, and it was nice because then I didn't have to I think in my original draft, I had to, like, think of a plausible way for them to know the information. So it's like, "So and so heard from so and so that," and yeah, and then I didn't have to do that anymore.
Yeah, I think, we're talking a little bit about, who chooses to tell the story in the narrative. Ellie is thinking about a professor that she had at one point who a typical question, if a tree falls in the woods and no one's there to hear it, does it really make a sound? But Ellie took it and twisted it to say if there's no one to record them or read them, they disappear. And later
Yes.
people will ask, did that really happen? Did that really exist?
Yes, I made that part up. I mean, not that it's made up. I mean, I it's something that I feel quite strongly that it is important to have the storytellers and the historians and the journalists in every part of the world. And, in conflict situations like this, journalists take enormous risks to get those stories. That's just one part of it. The next part is getting that story out. And as in Ellie's case, you do have to kind of weigh, in some cases, Ellie's afraid of access. And the censorship that she has to put in is in part like she doesn't want to get blocked from future briefings because she's seen as like an uncooperative news person.
Right. I think it's just really kind of interesting, and then I would also kind of flip it and think that Emma is a storyteller because we're
Yes.
seeing her daughter is goes disappeared, right? She is taken at the age of 14,
Yes.
14,
14.
taken to comfort stations, which I'm going to ask you about in a second, but
Hmm.
she's taken away, but you never stop being a mom. And
Hmm.
so she's writing letters to her daughter, kind of talking about what's happening and what's going on, what she's experiencing and that type of thing. So she's also telling a story and kind of trying to preserve that time that they're separated.
Yes, and that goes also to the issue of, I think, a lot of women's stories being undervalued. Like, when you look at history, there's coverage of the battles at the front lines. There isn't, and Ellie speaks about this too, there isn't as much coverage about what women are doing or what is something that if it only affects women, whether it would be covered. And so we rely on people like Emma who end up being sort of a self-trained journalist. So Ellie kind of makes that remark like we're the same thing. Although she later understands like no, we aren't, but Emma, through that role, is doing this very essential work. And later, when historians look back, it's things like that, diaries that people have kept. And, often it's not a person who's unofficial of, not a unofficial newspaper or anything like, but just an ordinary person writing down what happened to them every day. That shows us a timeline. And that's often where we see how war affects civilians in ways that, it doesn't matter to either army, but this is how the everyday people experience the brutality that's around them.
And I think that's what humanizes things is when you
Mhm.
hear that personal account and that personal story that we're not just reading facts and figures at this time, of day on this particular year, this happened and this is how many people were wounded and this is how many were killed. But when you have that human story behind of how they're struggling for food and how this is what they're eating, they have very little and how they're
Mhm.
stretching it and making it last and how they're helping, soldiers that are wounded.
Mhm.
And I was struck by a line in the book, seeing the MASH units and realizing how young the soldiers were, that they
Mhm.
were, you mentioned in the book, they were too young. Many of them were too young to have been married,
Mhm.
and they're hauntingly crying for their moms as they're
Yeah.
experiencing. I mean, it literally broke my heart,
Mhm.
but such a poignant scene for us to think about. I don't think it changes no matter what war we're fighting,
Mhm.
the impact it has on human beings.
Yeah, and a lot of those so to do the research, I watched interviews with a lot of veterans. So that was how I know that a lot of the soldiers didn't have their winter uniforms in December because one of the veterans said that. The ones at the Chosin did, but the ones in I think in other parts of Korea just did without it. But there is I think a part in the book where Ellie talks about the boys that she met and these boys lying about their age to enlist because this was from a veteran interview where he was saying like they were paying $75 a month at the time and so he like lied to enlist and I think he was only 15
Right.
and somehow nobody checked. I guess, a lot of people might not have documentation, but, it worked. He got in, but thinking of someone that young going into battle, it's really awful.
Yeah, I think about George, who was the
Mhm,
pilot who
mhm,
Ellie befriended by jumping on multiple flights with him and talking about why he chose
mhm,
to serve. And to your point, some were like they're paying $75 a month, which is a lot of money. Some were they're paying for education. And he was like,
mhm,
look, I'm representing the ordinary people at home
mhm,
that are good, that are honest, that are moral.
mhm,
That's who I'm fighting for. That's I'm their voice. I'm representing them.
mhm.
And I just think, we all do things for different reasons.
Yeah.
And you being able to extrapolate the different reasons why people show up and form a community to advance
Mhm.
what they believe their mission is.
Yes. Yeah. I think that is not just George, but a lot of the other people, and not just on the American side, but on all sides. I think Ellie makes this comment that everybody who, maybe not everybody, but a lot of people believe they're fighting for freedom. And she mentions that, like, whose freedom? And it's not like, each side is, nobody thinks that they're the enemy. I think that's the
Right.
thing we have to hold on to. Everyone has people that they want to protect. Everyone is worried about their homes in some way, and that's why they're there. Aside from the money, I mean, obviously it's split. People have different motivations, but for a lot of people, it was this idea that, I want to do something with my life.
Right. Something meaningful. I mean, I think we all kind of
Mhm,
struggle at some points for finding what our purpose is. So, with
mhm.
your work being what you do as an international human rights, women's rights attorney, how does that infuse your work and vice versa?
So I think I do put a lot of my own feelings and experience in it. So there was a time in the past when I worked on enforced disappearances, and that was why I have Emma's thread in there. Because prior to doing that work, I never thought about it very much. I sort of thought about the idea like, oh, well, you survived the war. Like, the worst thing is to die in the war. And if you survived, it's not so bad, which is until you talk to those people, it's very different. So, I mean, I think in every war, and it's whether someone was taken as prisoners of war, but I did have the opportunity to interview people about it and listening to what they say. There are people whose loved one disappeared like 20 years ago, and they're still effectively tortured by that absence. So that's why I chose to write from Emma's perspective,
Hmm.
because I do think when we talk about crimes or violations, we think about the victim, and yes, that's the primary person, but each victim is a world. There are people who love that person who are also hurt by what happens to them. So in this case, yeah, I really wanted to emphasize how it can be a form of torture and how Emma is consumed by trying to find what happened. And I think there's a lot of real life people who are like that, who are like Emma, who, think every day about that person. And I think there's even things that I've thought about, like where, for example, in the context of someone who's been kidnapped or abducted by enemy forces and they're a prisoner of war, parents really worrying, like, what's happening? Like, is my kid alive? You know? And there's some who think, like, is it better to die than to be tortured? And that's something Emma reckons with. Like, I think when you have someone who disappeared, you're always thinking about, like,
Right.
what they're going through. So that goes into, I think, not just motherhood, but being a parent in these wars. Like, when you're separated, how is the person you love? How are they doing?
Yeah, I think it's Ellie who says that no one was just a number. And
Mhm.
if my heart wasn't tethered, it would simply like not hurt anymore.
Mhm.
Goes to
Yeah.
the point of the fact that there's an impact that you said that one person, like they have a world. And I think
Yes.
there's a scene, and I know we'll talk about comfort stations because that's where Emma's daughter is believed to have been
Mhm.
forcibly removed and taken to. Can you talk a little
Mhm.
bit about comfort stations?
So during World War II, the Japanese military set up these brothels along the front lines. The idea had been, so the I starting with the rape of Nanking. I mean, that was a pivotal moment. These stations existed before then. So I looked at testimony from survivors coming out of these stations, and there are women who were taken in the 30s before the invasion of China, and there were these stations in Korea. But it was the rape of Nanking that really triggered a lot of international outcry, and so at that time, the Japanese imperial authorities decided to have these stations so their men would, essentially get sex like they would get rations, and then they would be less likely to rape civilians. I mean, these were the women who were put in these stations came from Japanese colonies, but there were also Chinese women who were kidnapped as the war moved through different parts of China. So there's a lot of very good resources on the survivors of military sexual slavery. But also, I like to recommend these two books because my book sort of deals with the aftermath and the community. But there are two, Honey in the Wound by Ji Young Han and White Chrysanthemum by Mary Lynn Brock, that follows the women who were taken. I think I would definitely encourage readers to go look at those. These stations were really brutal, and Emma makes this remark, there's a difference between a woman who is seen as a slave versus other women, and it's this idea like she is not human, you can do what you want to them, and the testimony is really awful, really, really graphic and harrowing testimony of what these girls went through. So, when I was researching this war in particular, you see as each side retreats, they destroy their stuff. So when the US retreated, they would, just burn all of their fuel because they didn't want the enemy to have it. This massive, they would destroy their tanks, their cars. But then these,
Everything.
yeah, but these women, that happened too as the Japanese began to lose in China, a lot of these women were just slaughtered. And it's just what women are put through. I think in many wars, women are treated as property, just part of, the horses that die, the things that you
It's a
use so that you can
commodity, or
fight
I think,
better.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah. So I think in this, I really wanted to show not just the person behind it. And again, I think read those other two books that I recommended because
right.
they follow the girls in that journey, but to show like this isn't just property. Like, this is someone who has an entire community that was revolving or not revolving around them per se, but they were part of the fabric of their
There's
community.
somebody's daughter, there's somebody's mom, there's somebody's
Yes.
sister, somebody's cousin,
Yes.
teacher. Yeah, I mean, you humanize it, and to the point where it causes some tension between Emo and Emma, because
Mhm.
Emma is so consumed with the grief of her daughter's disappearance and trying to find her again that it's almost like she doesn't give permission to Emo or to Pastor Peck or to their son Jamin
Mhm. Mhm.
to feel any grief or any loss, because she's the
Mhm.
one that has the authority on it and nobody else can feel bad.
Yeah, I think Emma sort of just thinks nobody cares as much as she does. And to be fair to Emma, I think that's true. I feel like,
Right.
it's different when you're a mom. Yeah, I wanted to write from the mom's perspective, especially just me as someone with kids. I think that's really altered how I look at things. I'm in a place where I can no longer work on children's rights issues because I get too upset about it. Like, there were times when I did when I was younger, and I just don't think I have, not that I don't think, I know I don't have the capacity to be able to work in that field anymore. So, yeah, in Emma's case, I think there are the other people who mourn her daughter's loss, but she's the one who spends, like, her entire life trying to find her and, like, hasn't, you know essentially that's become her life's mission.
Well, yeah, I mean, I can't imagine you could ever let go. I mean, I'm a
Mhm.
grown up, but my mom will say, like, "You're always gonna be my kid," and
Yeah.
still concerned about me and still asks things to make sure that I'm okay, even though allegedly allegedly a grown up. But
Yeah.
it's that fierce mother's love to protect and to want to see their kid doing well and to not
Mhm.
know where your child is. I can't imagine living in quote unquote limbo like that.
Yeah, yeah, and I think, I just saw my own mom recently, and I have a new appreciation for my mom after I became a mom, even through little things, and I tried to show that through Emma's letters, like, a lot of these little things that you do for each other that nobody else does, like, I had a piece of garbage in my hand, like, I unwrapped something, I had the wrapper, and I had to do something else, and I needed my hands free, and I just handed it to my mom. And, like, I don't think you could ever just do that to another person. You might say, like, "Oh, can you please hold this for me?" or something, but, like, to your mom, you can literally hand her a piece of garbage, and she'll be like, "My kid has garbage, I'll hold it for her."
Yeah.
And it's so small, but I just think about that's all of those things that add up. Like, there's no one in at least in my I mean, I guess there are a few other people like that, but it's so rare, and it's sort of, there's that photo of, I think, Beyoncé with her daughter, and she's holding a snack pack, and the caption
Yes.
was like, "No matter how glamorous you are some child's snack holder." And yeah, I think about those moments, so I tried to do that in Emma's letters, like the little things that she
Yeah,
thinks about.
and that's the thing you capture when we were talking earlier about ordinary things that are happening, and some of the people that you've interviewed in a lot of the documentaries that you watch to capture the ordinary moments set within the context of these really big moments in
Mhm.
history.
Yes. Yeah, that, for example, the birth, that was
Yes.
important to me to put in because I feel like unless you have women taking down stories or people who considers women's needs, a lot of the news we get from armed conflict and war, they don't think about, like, all the pregnant women. Like, there's
Mm-mm.
still a ton of pregnant women who need places to deliver. There's very little coverage, and to think like, okay, you have these refugees, you have people who need medical care, someone has to provide it.
Yeah, I'm thinking back to one of the conflicts early on in the Ukraine war and showing up where refugees were, like, on the subway platform were a ton of strollers because those moms knew
Mhm. Yeah.
that the refugees that were coming and fleeing that conflict had young kids with them, and young kids, they need a lot of things, and you need a lot
Mhm.
like, extra arms, to your point of, you
Yeah.
needed to do something, hand your mom garbage, but just capturing the good and the women that think, like, guys don't always think like, "Oh, you don't need a
Yeah.
stroller, you can just carry them." Well, they're not exactly like
Yeah.
newborns and lightweight anymore.
Yeah, I think a lot of people might not think about a need that they themselves don't have. And so that's also why it's so important to have women represented in all of these things. And so sometimes I look at these committees that are addressing these issues and there aren't women on them. So of course, like someone wrote a really good article about even just designing cities and how someone, if it's like a young man, they would think a ramp is there for a person in a wheelchair. They don't really because they themselves don't have a stroller if it's like a younger man without kids, and then but it's like every child under 3 will also need that ramp. So we do have a lot of cities that are very not just, like, inaccessible for people with disabilities, but very, like, not child friendly.
Yeah. I'm thinking like I have a nonfiction book discussion at work, and we
Mhm.
kind of focus on urban issues. And we read like The Death and Life of Great American Cities by Jane Jacobs, and how
Oh, I haven't
cities
read
are this,
that.
yeah, was written, gosh, back in the 60s, but still really relevant. And then recently read a book about invisible data about how studies aren't conducted with women to separate the data from male versus female.
Mhm. Mhm.
Things like the cars, right? There's
Mhm.
crash test dummies, but they're built based on male's anatomy, not a female. So we're smaller, differently proportioned. So, like, oh, yeah, those safety crashes do great if you're a guy, but if you're a girl or
Mhm.
woman, different things
Mhm.
happen, or how certain data, like, you have the data, you just choose not to extrapolate it to make decisions that are more inclusive, I guess we'll say.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah.
So, yeah, it was an amazing story. I mean, even think about there's a scene where they're experiencing bombing. And so
Mhm.
Emma and Emo and Ellie head to the shelter
Yes.
to be in the basement that's really kind of dank and not so great. And with everybody in that little town community
Mhm.
trying to survive.
Mhm.
And now we see the benevolence of a pastor's wife start to
Mhm.
pray,
Mhm.
basically saying the Our Father prayer.
Mhm.
I think Ellie's like, I don't know that I would
Yeah.
I would say that." And And this line by Emo is, "A prayer isn't everything these women need, but it's the only thing I can give them and
Mhm.
probably the only thing they can have."
Yes. So that scene, I designed around a few things. So for me, I'm Buddhist and my husband is Christian. So I actually had to check a lot of things with him. And originally, I got the Lord's Prayer wrong and nobody caught it. My husband didn't catch it. My mother in law didn't catch it. And like later, I only caught it because luckily I was invited to someone's wedding and they had it at their wedding. And I was like, wait a minute, that line is not because I've reviewed this draft so many times. So I heard this line and I said, that's not in my book. And I asked my husband, he's like, oh yeah, that's part of it. So I was like, why didn't you tell me? But anyway, the point of this too was knowing that, I'm an American and I write for a lot of American readers. I want um people to know that a lot of times our quote unquote enemies may be a lot more similar to us than we realize. And I think in a lot of wars, it's very common to think of the enemy as not even like a person or as, I think, brainwashed or robotic without thinking like these are people who have a lot of their own opinions and beliefs. Like they are probably a lot more similar to us than we are different. And I think
Right.
that's one scene that surprised a lot of people, in part because I think people don't know about that history in North Korea. But that's just one element. It might, and in this case, it happens to be religion, but there's so much we have in common with other people. And I think there may be a lot of stories or intentional, I mean, what we would call propaganda to try to convince us otherwise. But that's what I wanted to show with the story is that when you are put with people who are, again, allegedly your enemy, I think you'll always find something you have in common. You'll find ways to stick together. That was very, I mean, I think that's the core of this book that, Emo says that people are the same everywhere. I
Yes.
do believe that. I think for the most part, people are the same. Like we might have different cultures, different religions, and different practices, but we are at the core very similar. I mean, as moms, we all have like issues dealing with our children and vice versa. Like those are
Right.
universal things. The remark you made about just children needing so much gear, I mean, I think that's something we could universally sympathize with.
I mean, they're this little person and there's a bag and a stroller and the this and the that. And I'm like, it takes up like half of, a trunk. And the
Yeah.
like 8 pounds. Come on.
Yeah, yeah,
Like I'm a lot more
exactly.
than 8 pounds and I don't require half as much.
Yeah.
Yeah. But you are correct. And I guess that it's a big existential question is how do we find our way to our commonality so that we stop fighting? I
I
mean,
have
it's
a
a
lot
bigger
of
question than anyone can really answer, but given your work, I mean, you see these atrocities that happen and you're
Mhm.
advocating so that there's some accountability and restitution and practices so this can stop happening.
I think it depends on ordinary people, and I really believe that. It's the people who read a book about a culture that's different from their own. I do firmly believe that reading makes you a better person. I don't think everyone can afford to travel. I think if you can afford to travel and study abroad, that's even better because, and I think that's also a sad thing as a result of a lot of conflicts, nationals are forbidden to come to your country
Mhm.
and that's a pretty common policy. But then I think that leads to further isolation. So, for example, Pastor Peg, similar to my grandfather, he worked a lot with American missionaries. So there's this idea like he knows they're not all evil. He's met different Americans. And I think we need to stop letting governments determine what we think about people. Like ordinary people are very different from their governments. Not always. And when I say not always, I mean, again, when there's a lot of propaganda, I think you can convince ordinary people to do really awful things. But for the most part, I think people want to do good. I do believe that like the majority of people want to do good in some way with like different capacity for it. I think people are seldom just explicitly evil. Of course, that happens, but I think that is the minority. So, in some ways, technology has helped us be able to look at other cultures differently. I'm just thinking books and translation, but I think support for education and reading. I mean, I find the book community is a very special community because it is one where people, I think, are curious. They like stories and they're drawn to human stories. So, I wish there was more support for that, and that is something that does kind of scare me as, I saw some statistic that people read a lot less. Uh,
Mhm.
I hope that changes. I mean, I'm sure there's other ways to get that information, but there's something about sitting and spending 300 pages with the person, like, that's a significant chunk of your time.
425, but I'm just saying.
Sorry, yeah, I think mine is 400.
Yeah, it's 425.
Yeah.
And I loved every single page, but you're right. There's an opportunity to understand somebody else, to learn. I mean, we all read for different reasons. Some of us read
Mhm,
because we're curious and we want to learn something. Some of us read because we want to be entertained. Some of us read because we need to escape. Some of us read because we want to
mhm,
not feel alone. We want to see somebody else just like us in a book.
yeah,
And to know, and I think that no matter what you read, if you're somebody who's an avid reader, what you basically find in every book is that you can connect with those characters in the
mhm,
book.
yes,
It
yes,
doesn't matter if you're reading historical fiction, if you're reading, literary fiction, if you're reading a cozy mystery, there is something human and relatable in all
mhm,
those characters that's gonna resonate with you somewhere, which
yes,
is something that AI can never do.
mhm.
So I think it's a gift that you give us to be able to write these stories so that we
Thank
can see a
you.
different way of
Thank you,
looking at the
thank
world
you.
and inspiring us to be better people. I think about the Olympics. I mean,
Mhm,
most of us will not watch gymnastics every Sunday like we might football or 62 games of baseball. But when we get together for the Olympics, not only are we kind of together,
mhm.
it's all the backstories to that person who's
Yeah.
doing the gymnastics that get us. It's that humanity that their old gymnasium where they trained burned down or was destroyed by a tornado, and now they drive 4 hours each way, and it's that kinda stuff that
Mhm,
humanizes everything
mhm.
and makes us, like, want to be better people as
Yeah,
well.
yeah. I think it's, the motivations too. I think when
Mhm.
you're reading a book of that length, you don't just get the action typically, you get into another person's mind in a way that's very, very hard to do with other media. I guess you can, but, just being able to, like, be inside someone's brain.
Yeah, yeah, it is, empathy and sympathy. I think more so
Mhm,
empathy because you're in that person's shoes and you're right along with them.
mhm,
Um, and you're just reminded that, to your point, there's so much more we have in common than
mhm,
we don't.
mhm.
My goodness, I would talk to you the whole rest of the day. It's hard to believe, like, time has flown by. Um, so this is Story's End, final 5 questions. So early on, Ellie finds herself stressed and overwhelmed. And
Mhm.
as a way to calm herself and bring herself some peace, she thinks about the sea lions at home. When you're stressed and overwhelmed, what do you think about?
Think of things from home. So that is what I do, or a place where I was really relaxed. Most recently, I went on a vacation to Costa Rica and we stayed at this beautiful place in the jungle or sorry, in the rainforest where there were monkeys outside the window. And sometimes I actually just think about that place. So it's not really home, but it's like a place where I was just very happy.
And very
So
present.
yeah.
Very good. You did a lot of research for this book, right? And we know that
Mhm.
not every bit of your research makes it into the book. Unfortunately, some things end up, as they say, on the cutting room floor. What is one thing that you learned that you wish you could have found some way to incorporate in this story?
Ooh, there's so much that I cut out. No, sorry, let me think about that. I think I would have wanted to put a little bit more about the dynamics of segregation and how it affected the servicemen. So segregation was still ongoing in the US, but the army, by executive order from Truman, was desegregated, and that was a very difficult process. But then a lot of the Black men who fought in the Korean War, and other Black service members afterwards had a lot of trouble getting their benefits because the whatever benefits office, I don't know the name for it, was usually in the white part of town.
Hmm.
So when they went there, well, one, it was very hard for them to get there. And if they did go and fill in their paperwork, if it was a very racist person working there, they would just throw it away. So I guess I'll take this opportunity to talk about this organization called, shoot, I forgot the name of the organization now, the Black Veterans Project. The Black
Yes.
Veterans Project,
Okay.
one of the founders is Kyle Bibby, and he works to help Black veterans get their benefits.
Yeah. I read about that in, I think it's The Color of Law.
Okay.
Yeah. And talked about a lot of the disadvantages that Black servicemen experienced after
Hmm.
serving, no different than their white comrade, but yet completely different once they got home.
Hmm.
It's really sad. Would you rather be stuck in an Uber with Emo or Emma?
I think emo would be more interesting in terms of like what she would say. Like Emma is very nice and she's funny. I kind of modeled her after one of my friends' moms, kind of. But
Mhm.
emo, yeah, I know like she can be a little scary, but you wouldn't be bored.
No, exactly. And because you're stuck, you would have the opportunity to remove some of those layers. It makes her so darn fascinating. What is a book that you wish you could read again for the first time?
There was another one. There are a few recently that I was like, oh, it's such a beautiful book. One that I did read twice was The Jinn Waits 100 Years
Okay.
by Shubnam Khan.
Okay.
And that one it's like a ghost story, mystery, romance all together, but she is such a beautiful writer. And I think she said it took 10 years for her to write this book, and it shows because I read it the first time and then I felt like I didn't do a good enough job reading it. And so I read it again right after. Yeah, I thought her writing was really marvelous. And there's someone else, a few others recently that but I sometimes I feel like I have the memory of a goldfish now where I remember the feeling of loving this book, but then the title and the author are escaping me.
I understand. As a librarian, people are like, "What are you reading?" And I'm like, my mind goes completely blank.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, I've got like 3 books going. Yeah, just goes right out. And then the last question, what song would always be on a road trip playlist?
Ooh, I mean, right now all we're listening to is K-pop Demon Hunter, so it's hard for me to think because like that's my kids love that, so
Yeah,
it would be that right now, but maybe it would change in a few years.
there you go. So, thank you to everybody who is listening. A gigantic thank you to E.J. Chung, whose new book, The Young Will Remember, published this week. If you're looking for a story that will shine a light on part of history we are not often familiar with, this book is for you. If you're looking for a book with 3 remarkable women who we journey alongside as they face unspeakable odds, this book is for you. If you're looking for a book told from a place of compassion with beautiful language to fully capture the humans who experienced this war, this book is for you. As Eve writes, on this earth we must anchor ourselves in our shared humanity, for if we don't look out for one another, who else will? I think this is a lesson for all of us, no matter who or where we are at war, and how important it is for us to stand up. And then may I end with this line from this remarkable book. Lighting a torch can be frightening, and it is often lonely, but when that fire catches, it is brilliant. Thank you so very much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for inviting me. And yeah, that's one of my favorite lines too.